It's done.
Thank you. Good evening, comrades, and welcome to this meeting organised by Anti-Capitalist Resistance. My name is Terry Conway, and I'm a member of the ACR editorial board. I'm not going to be saying very much before we get started. Just some accessibility tips before we do get started. We are recording tonight's meeting. If people don't want to appear in the video, then they should keep their videos off. However, when people are speaking for the discussion, it is much better if people can, unless their broadband is very low, that they put their videos on, because that allows people who need to lip read to follow them more clearly. I massively apologize because I thought that closed captioning was enabled, and unfortunately it isn't, and I can't re-enable it without throwing us all out and starting again, which doesn't really work. So I hope that's not an issue for anybody. I think that everybody, whether or not they are a disabled person, will be, certainly should be aware that during the pandemic that we've been living in over the last year, the barriers that disabled people faced before the pandemic have been raised even higher in the last year. And that's an issue of major concern. But tonight's meeting, although it'll touch on some of the issues that have come up in the last year and that have made those things sharper and possibly more noticed by people outside the disabled people's community, is looking behind that at the development of disabled people's ideas, disabled people's organisation, and how the left should be relating to those questions, and perhaps touching on some of the reasons why the left has not been, in my opinion at least, very good in doing so. We're very privileged to have two excellent speakers tonight, Sandra Daniels and Bob Williams-Findlay, who are going to do a presentation for us, which will last around 30 minutes. We'll then take a break for access reasons, and we'll then have the second half of the meeting for discussion and contribution, questions and contributions from the floor. So thank you very much for attending tonight. And Susan, do you want to start the screen share? Thank you. Can you see Bob?
I can't see Bob. I don't know if Bob can see me. But
I can when you talk.
oh, okay. So let's go.
Okay, so today's presentation is just a broad brushstroke of the issues that need to be raised in terms of politics, to the disability. We've called it the politics of disability versus disability politics, because we wanted to differentiate between the dominant ideas and practice around what society sees as disability and the alternative, if we like, arguments put forward by disabled people. So I'm going to start with a quote by Mark Oliver. As far as disability is concerned, if it is seen as a tragedy, then disabled people will be treated as if they are the victim of some tragic happening or circumstance. This treatment will occur not just in everyday interactions, but will also be translated into social policies which will attempt to compensate the victim for the tragedies that have befallen them. Alternatively, it is logically follows that if disability is defined as social oppression, then disabled people will be seen as the collective victim of an uncaring or unknowing society, rather than as individual victims of circumstance. Such a view will be translated into social policy geared toward alleviating oppression rather than compensating individuals. It almost goes without saying that at present the individual and tragic view of disability dominates both social interaction and social policies. There are two questions, however. Is it really that simple? And what makes capitalist societies uncaring or unknowing? Next slide.
So the politics of disability stems from dominant ideology and practice which are concerned with either managing burdens on society or are based upon eugenics, which advocate a kill or cure approach. How disability is viewed, therefore, is historically pacific and relates the interest of capital. Neoliberal social policy shifts the gaze from welfare dependent to scrounger and self-reliant. Next slide.
Russell and Mahopsa said, we take the view that disability is socially created category derived from labour relations, a product of the exploitative economic structure of capitalist society, one which creates and then oppresses the so-called disabled body of one of the conditions that allow the capitalist class to accumulate wealth. Seen in this slide, disability is an aspect aspect of the central contradiction of capitalism and politics that do not accept this and politics that do not accept this are at best fundamentally flawed strategies of reform, or worse, from a bourgeois ideology that prevent this from being seen. However, this should not be viewed simply as economically determined. We have to understand the relationship between the economic base and the superstructure of capitalist societies. Sandra.
So radical disability politics sees disability as an imposed social restrictions. The emancipation struggle is to end the systematic social oppression of people with significant impairments, which result in them being excluded from or marginalised within mainstream social relations. Disability politics concerned with removing the barriers, the social restrictions, and that's betterment and transformative. Disabled people have become a collective political identity which denotes their social situation, disabled by society. The birth of the disabled people's movement. Having a disability is conventionally regarded as a personal tragedy which the individual must overcome, or as a medical problem to which the individual must become adjusted. In 1976, however, the Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation in Britain made a significant advancement when it pointed out that disability is something imposed on top of our impairments by the way we are unnecessarily isolated and excluded from participation in society. Amongst those concerned with disability, it soon became common ground that it is society which disables persons with impairments. Next slide. Sorry, my slide didn't move on.
This necessitates a rethinking of prevalent definition, leaving aside biological or physical and psychological definition of disability, would make it appear that impaired persons are naturally and therefore justifiably excluded from the labour force. Even mainstream definitions have serious shortcomings. The terminology associated with mainstream definitions have been criticised by social model theory of disability because it relies primarily on medical definition and uses a biophysiological definition of normality. Further, the environment with which this disadvantage is located is represented as being neutral, and any negative consequences of this approach for the person with an impairment are regarded as inevitable or acceptable rather than as disabling barrier. At Russell and Moxa again. So, the pious became the first disability liberation group in the UK, or more than a first in the world, and certainly the most advanced in the world. What it had to offer disabled people was an analysis of disability that presented disability as a social relationship in which disabled people were oppressed. And in doing this, they were overturning the concept of disability as a biologically determined natural condition. They define disability as the disadvantage or restriction of activity caused by a contemporary social organisation which takes little or no account of people who have impairment and exclude them from the mainstream of social activity. However, I believe there's a missing element to that definition, because if we go back to what we've just said, surely it's the way in which capitalism does take us into account and dismisses us because of our lack of self-worth, which results in us not being taken into account. So we need to put this into historical context. You pay social interpretation of disability in part rests on a critique of the World Health Organization International Classification of Impairment, Disability and Handicap. Oliver's models drew from the prior social interpretation of disability and other theories. He has the individual tragedy model and the social model of disability. Under pressure from Disabled People International and the need-to-late capitalism, the World Health Organization developed the International Classification of Functioning, often known as the Biopsychosocial model. Next.
So the individual model of disability explores how capitalist society socially constructs and creates disability. Social construction around dominant ideologies, culture, for example, individualism and normality. Social creation is the systematic failure to address disabling barriers and institutional discrimination. Biosocial combines deficit model, Parsons-Sick role, and negative social interaction. The tragedy model, disability as a tragedy. The individual tragedy model sees disability as being the degree to which a person fails to conform to the expected and accepted norms linked to daily functional activity. Disability is located within the individual and therefore blames their impairment for any social disadvantage they encounter. It maintains, next slide. It maintains that disability should be cured through medical and treatment. But what are the implications of this approach?
Hello.
If the person's situation cannot be altered this way,
No, me refiero que el piso ese que te lo van a hacer.
Can you mute the person?
I can't find them because of the... Can you mute yourself, George? Thank you.
Okay, I'll start again. Maintains that disability should be cured through medicine and treatment. But what are the implications of this approach if a person's situation cannot be altered this way? Leads to action to end the suffering or placing disabled people into special provisions due to their special needs. Next slide.
It is common for the social model to work with two definitions. Impairment is viewed as an indirect illness or inherited condition that causes or likely to cause a loss or difference in the way the body and mind work. And disability, the loss or limitation of opportunity to take part in the general life of the community at equal level with others due to physical and social barriers. These two definitions, however, come from the social movement, which is a broad spectrum of political views and therefore can be contested by more radical definitions. However, a social model sees disability, as we've said, of being imposed on top of people who have impairment. Disability is viewed as a social relationship people with impairment experience. Therefore, people with impairment are disabled by the structures, systems, attitude and culture found within specific societies. Next slide. The biopsychosocial model, however, is a hybrid of the World Health Organization international classification of function and Union methodology. Union is an American insurance company but behind the tourist reform of the world benefit system. Maria Barry says, the way in which disability is contextualized influences our perception of people with disabilities, as long as medical classification predominate the norm of what is healthy, and this standard are used to address and describe the issue, identify situations and make recommendations. Eugenics will camouflage the issues and allow a person living in disabling situations. Next slide.
So disabilities is an umbrella term covering impairments, activity limitations and participation restrictions. An impairment is a problem in the body function or structure. An activity limitation is a difficulty encountered by an individual in executing a task or action. while a participation restriction is a problem experienced by an individual involved in life situations.
So what we can see there is that the biopsychosocial maintains the dominant ideological view that it's not society that really disabled, but the individual impairment. So, who are disabled people? Next slide.
So Mike Oliver said, for me, disabled people are defined in terms of three criteria. 1, they have impairments. 2, they have experienced depression as a consequence. And 3, they identify themselves as a disabled person. Next slide.
He went on to say, using the generic term disabled people does not mean that I do not recognise differences and experience within the group, but that in exploring this, we should start from ways oppression differentially impact on different groups of people rather than the differences in experience among individuals with different impairments. Next slide.
The way oppression differentially impacts on different groups of people, for example, are people with physical impairments, people with cognitive impairments, and people with invisible impairments. Next slide.
There is a debate over what we mean by rights, and in discussion, we might want to come back to this. Next slide. Disabled people reaction.
Yeah, that was Manchester.
Next slide.
Next slide, yeah. Okay. The cuts on disabled people. So the Tory press was used to stigmatise disabled people in a similar style to the Nazis, forcing disabled people who are also ill to enter the labour market that discriminates against them, and they suppressed data on climate suicide. The cuts in social care, attacks on independent living, and the restructuring of the NHS has puts many disabled people at risk. Independent living, next slide. Brilliant. Independent living is the ability to decide and choose what a person wants, where to live and how, what to do and how to set about doing it. These goals and decisions about a person's life and the freedoms to participate fully in the community have been and will continue to be the essence of what independent living is. It is also the taking and establishment of self-control and self-determination in the total management of a person's everyday life and affairs. It is about ensuring that all disabled people have the equality of opportunity in their chances and choices of life like everybody else. And that's a quote from John Evans. Next slide.
So the problem is that understanding of disability policy is extremely poor because in many ways they buy into the dominant discourse because often the politics, disability policy is not raised in the arenas that they operate within. In fact, Ernest Mandel is one of the few non-disabled Marxists to even engage with the issue. Many of the less serious policies and practice exclude disabled people and are therefore albeit unintentionally colluding in the social oppression of disabled people. The reason I laugh is that yesterday I was attacked for having identity politics, because really the real struggle can we be won by the working class. So there you are. Next slide. Many disabled academics and activists are left of centre politically. Disability policy recognise from an early stage that intersectionality was an important issue in terms of understanding simultaneous oppression within the diverse community of disabled people. What that means is quite simple. If you are a disabled woman, then you're encountered with some restriction and not necessarily going to be the same as that of a disabled man, because sexism feeds into the way in which a disabled woman is devalued. The issue facing the left is to recognise that disabled people are part of the anti-capitalist struggle, and therefore you've got to recognise that nothing about us without us. Come on, Sandra. That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to Sandra and Bob. As I said before, but not everybody was here, we're now going to take a 5-minute access break. For some of us, that's critical to be able to participate adequately in the next bit of the discussion. Can I propose, Susan, that you pause the recording? Otherwise, recording. Okay, thanks very much. So there's now time for questions and contributions. If people can, it's better if people raise a virtual hand, which you will find if you've got an updated version of Zoom under reactions, and if you haven't, under participants. But if you can't do that, if you try waving your hand, I will, or another bit of your anatomy, I will try and catch a glimpse of people, although that's complicated because we are on 2 screens. Let's see, anybody who wants to ask a question, make a comment. Jeff, do you want to unmute yourself?
Right, yeah, nobody else seems to want to, so I'll go. Yeah, a few things. One, in terms of the presentation of people with impairments on TV, there's been a big increase, I think, over the last few years. And you've got Vera, there was I don't know what she was actually, a secretary or something, in, I don't think she's a police officer in a wheelchair. You've got Liz Carr in, I've forgotten the bloody title now, Silent Witness. You've got the A word, and there's been quite a number of Sue Thomas, FBI, about a deaf woman who worked for the FBI. So there's been quite a lot. And then clearly there is the last leg. But in each of them, I think they have a very different view to disability, to that being put forward by Bob and by Sandra. This is very much the heroic individual struggling against their impairment rather than against their discrimination by society. And, you know, I mean, Sue's, my wife's niece, is a little person. She's the first person in the world, I think, to be president or chair or whatever of the Little Persons of New Zealand, and also the Little Persons of America, where she now lives, and she's a lawyer. Now, there are a lot of problems, I think, with some of her attitudes, because she's a very ardent Christian. But I've been reading some of her blogs, and they're quite interesting. But she talks about how, you know, if she goes into a hotel, nobody sees her because of her size, because the counters are so large. But she sees the problem as her height almost, rather than the fact that they don't take into account the fact that there are some people who are very small stature, or maybe in a wheelchair or whatever, who aren't going to be able to be seen easily from a counter or see over the counter. So you have sections of people actively involved in disability campaigning, and particularly, you know, with what Sue's niece is doing, and also the last leg, where they clearly talk very much about disability, but in terms of their impairments, they don't have a view of disability politics. So no, it's not unusual for people in a particular situation to have very different views about how to progress, what issues there are, what's needed. I mean, you know, we've been very, very critical about attempts to talk about the Jewish community. So it's clear that there is not simply a disabled community any more than that. Just briefly as well, some people will know that I had very, very severely impaired daughter who had very difficult to control epilepsy, who unfortunately died a few years ago. But she was classed as not having capacity. Now, leaving aside the fact that the Mental Capacity Act says there's no such thing as not having capacity. You might not have capacity to make this decision or that decision, or do this, that, or the other, but you do not have a blanket term of lack of capacity. The way in which she was assessed was, well, there was nobody there who could understand her communication method, because she couldn't speak, she can't write or couldn't write, but she did communicate. She was quite capable of understanding what was being said to her. I can see Terry nodded, Terry knew her. But they may as well have interviewed her in Mandarin, because that, you know, essentially they did not use the method that was going to allow her to make her own choices. Okay, leave it there.
Thanks. I've got Dave and then Jude.
Hi Bob, hi Sandra, how are you? I hope you're well. I wanted to raise a question, see your opinion about charities, because it seems to me, for disabled people, charities are a big deal. I mean, they sort of dominate. the provision in many ways. I worked for the what was called the Spastic Society when I was very young, and that gave my first contact really with disabled people in a meaningful way. And I'm sure it still dominates in terms of both providing support and service, but also in terms of raising money, all this stuff about charity. And I wonder whether you can give your experiences of how we can politically react to all that. I mean, it always strikes me, I'm in Italy at the moment, not down here, and in Italy and France and places, charity exists, but it's not as big, it seems to me, as in the UK. I don't know about America. Susan might want to say something about America, but in the UK, in Britain, it's a big deal, the charity. I mean, it's really dominant. In terms of the news as well, and the coverage on the TV networks, we're always getting stuff about people raising money, sponsoring, people walking up and down their garden, all this sort of stuff. I just wonder what your reaction is and what we can do about it, and what's the best sort of campaigning we can do and the rest of it. Okay.
Thanks, Dave. Jude?
Hi, Sandra and Roland. Thank you so much for such an engaging and really well-considered exploration of the issues and the different models that have been used to think about disability and the ways in which people are disabled by society. I thought in particular your explanation of the problems of the biopsychosocial model was really insightful and really helpful to understand why that is not a productive way of engaging with these kinds of questions. I think the use of the social model as a way of understanding the ways in which people are disabled by society seems to me to be something that might be of benefit and could enhance and improve an anti-capitalist analysis of society more generally. So the principle of society disabling people rather than someone inhabiting the disability in their own body seems to me to be something that a broader kind of anti-capitalist analysis of society can learn from disability activist movements. And I wondered if you had any experiences or suggestions that you could make about ways in which anti-capitalist movements can learn from disability studies and disability activists in this kind of way, because it seems like there's a great deal of very perceptive analysis of some of the restrictions that are placed on people, some of the limitations and ways in which people are disabled, that actually disabled and non-disabled people alike could benefit from this kind of model.
Thanks, Jude. I've got 3 more people indicating, but I just want to check with Bob and Sandra whether you want to come back at this point.
Can we take those 3 first?
Sure.
I'll go first and I'll hand over to Sandra. If we start with that last point, but widen it slightly, what we've got to remember is that disability politics, just like Marxism or socialism, is not one set ideas, and the disabled people movement was a social movement that stretched from the right, who just wanted to be accepted with good little capitalists, right over to the revolutionary left, who understood the nature of capitalism and you need to overthrow it. So what that means is it requires interpretation of disability tried to keep everybody on board, but underneath it was a critique of capitalism. And my other developed two models. The individual model, that is a critique of what society does now, dominant ideas and practice, and the social model can be read in a reformist or revolutionary way. And it's about betterment. I imagine us better for us now than trying to be inclusive as possible, but really ultimately only by removing capitalism can we really emancipate everybody. And charities, right, let's get this clear. The original idea of charity was no different to mutual aid in many ways. It was about supporting other people. But within the Victorian era, charity were there to be the if you refuge collectors on behalf of the capitalists to mop up the groups of people who were going to cause a problem for those that want to make profit. Therefore, charities are, the oppressive wing of the state because they're there to control. And yes, of course, the spastic side today that was set up by parents who wanted to make sure their kids got a good education in life, but very much fitting into dominant individual trading model. And I'm going to hand over to Sandra, who can talk more about the biopsychosocial model and how that is used in the benefit system, and she can talk about her own experiences of how that works.
Thanks, Bob. So yeah, I'll talk a little bit about my own experience swapping from disability living allowance to PIP, which although I was obviously awarded DLA as a for a lifetime, when the government decided, the Tory government, to introduce personal independence payments, like many other people, you had to reapply for the benefit. And PIP was very much based upon the individual, but also about what you could do and what age you had. And if you couldn't prove that those things, then therefore it was very much, well, you can manage. And I remember during the assessment, I was asked by the assessor if I could get onto a bus. Well, of course, as a wheelchair user, now buses are accessible. Yes, I can get on a bus. They are accessible for me to get on. But there's a whole load of issues in relation to that, because obviously it's about getting to the bus stop, and I live on a hill, so one way or the other you're going uphill. And also it's about whether you can actually get onto the bus, because there's one wheelchair space, and so therefore whether or not somebody's in that space, maybe a buggy or another wheelchair use, whether or not you can access the bus. So I said yes, and she's like, oh great, But the issue isn't about accessing the bus. There's a whole load of issues about getting to the bus stop, and also about, obviously, the weather and so on and so forth. And what was said to me was, no, we don't take that into consideration. It's very much about what you actually do in it. So I think, it's very, we're getting confused. It's still the individual model, and it's still very much focused on the person rather than the barriers and the environment and the lack of access that disabled people face. And you're right, people are right. I think, there's a lot of disabled people aren't politicised, so therefore they go with the dominant view, the individual model within society, and that's what people know. So yeah, that is the dominant view, and a lot of disabled people don't know any other view. They don't know the social model, so that is what they live by. I also wanted to say something about communication, because that was raised. And I worked for an advocacy project, and it was a user-led group. So it was called People First Birmingham, and the group was user-led, and it was run by and for people with learning disabilities. And one of the big issues was about communication, and often people didn't have the actual sort of tools to be able to communicate. They often didn't have people that worked with them or were given the support to use communication and to communicate in the way that was accessible to them. So we were still very dependent on whether people could speak and read and write. So one of the things the project did was it looked at different ways of supporting people to communicate. It used a lot of pictures and easy words, which was called Easy Read. And so everything they produced as an organisation, as a group, was in this Easy Read. So, and that was one of the things they really advocated for, was that, there was different formats, and in particular this Easy Read, because often learning disabled people are not thought about in any shape or form.
Thanks, Sandra. Okay, I've now got 6 people on the list, so I'm going to take Liz and then Roland and then Rick, and then Sandra and Bob will come back, and then I've got John and Susan and me, and then we'll see. So, Liz.
Thank you, Terry. I wanted to ask a question. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. I wanted to ask a question about how the social model works in international context. Because, in this country since 1995, what was originally the Disability Discrimination Act, we had training of people in organisations about medical and social models and so on. So at a certain level, it's established within the culture of work organisations, and people in human resource departments are training about it. The basis, in other words, of fair treatment of disabled people is assumed to be applying the social model. That's often the sort of dominant thinking. But there are parts of the world where these concepts may not have been translated at all, or where it isn't there in the language if we're outside the English-speaking world. So I really want to ask you about this concept in terms of how well is it travelled internationally or not, and what are the implications of that for disabled people?
Thanks, Liz. Roland?
Yes, I knew Jeff's daughter, and I'm very well aware of the fact that she couldn't speak did not mean that she couldn't communicate. I know several of us here know the struggles that Jeff and Sue had to establish that this was a young woman who knew her own mind, knew what she wanted, and to establish that, to try to find a way in which she could live as autonomous a life as she was able to, without other people determining you're not able to do this. It was a real struggle for them. And I mean, I'm aware on a very different level, but I'm aware of the difficulties we've had to confront in our family with our daughter, and the difficulties she faces, and the way in which there's both a lack of understanding and a lack of acceptance of people's abilities, people's lack of abilities, people's difficulties. I know a number of times we've come about both in terms of what people are able to do and in terms of Sandra was talking about of claiming benefits. And I know the relief that we've felt when dealing with an agency, when we find people who actually understand the issues and are sympathetic to the issues. And I think one of the things we've got to be talking about is much more training for people working in all these agencies for awareness, acceptance, understanding of the different ways people communicate, the different needs people have. Because sometimes policy is actually there to enable people to do things, but the people who implement it are not aware of this or don't have the sympathy or understanding. So I think that's one thing that we've got to work on. The other thing is, I was thinking again, I think when Sandra was when Jeff was speaking about a frightening article I read, I think in The Guardian today, about a whole industry now in the United States of people claiming to represent people with disabilities, taking over, acting as agents for them, taking over their lives, taking over their property, and in fact shunting them off to homes and in effect stealing their property. I mean, there's a real problem of agency and of accepting that people who may not be able to communicate, may not be able to move, actually do know what they want and are capable of making decisions. And I mean, one of the things that I think we all need to work on is ways in which, as a society, we can enable people with impairments to have their needs and their wishes implemented.
Thanks, Roland. Rick?
Yeah, thanks. I should say that most of what I know about social care, I've learned from people like Bob and Sandra, and in particular in the meetings of the Reclaim Social Care movement, which we've all been involved in for the last couple of years. And we are working together now in Birmingham on something with the local council. But what I wanted to say something about was, I mean, every radical movement faces strategies of co-option from capital. And I'm wondering what the relationship between the independent living movement and new capitalist developments in that field are likely to be. And it seems to me that, I mean, in the early years of austerity, the social care market grew as government cut council spending, forcing councils to privatise even more. But then the cuts boomeranged as declining public council spending reduced private sector profits. In fact, several big social care companies went bust or nearly went bust a couple of years ago. So I think what is happening now is the development of a new capitalist model of social care, personalised capitalist social care. And I think it's got three elements. And the first is to do with independence through personal payments. Now, I think I understand that that can be very liberating in many ways for disabled people, but it can also has the potential to assimilate and de-radicalize independent living. It creates a new informal labour market in which recipients of care support become employers, and the employees, the workers, are mainly women, as in the rest of the care industry, often low paid, without qualifications, and with no collective organisation or power to protect those conditions. It's a very neoliberal transactional relationship it can be. Second element, I think, in the new emerging capitalist model is a reliance on community support. And the key term is community asset-based approaches. And these could potentially be radical, but they're much more likely to be a compensation for cuts. And it's heavily reliant on volunteers. An early example was Cameron's Big Society and the role of charities playing a key role in this. Currently in Birmingham, for example, where I live, we have the new Neighbourhood Network scheme, which is a huge city-wide program for trying to gear local community assets to the needs of people with disabilities. It's often presented as co-production, but it's only co-production at ground level. There's no co-production in the town hall and the council house. And the third mechanism, which I've only really just learnt about, is social impact investing. It was created by 3 bits of legislation: the Localism Act 2011, the Public Services Social Value Act 2012, and the Care Act 2014. In all of these, the focus is on outcomes. And that sounds quite positive, but it actually creates a new form of investment called social impact bonds, which are very attractive to capitalist social entrepreneurs, you know, philanthro-capitalism, where they get payment by results. So in fact, the results and the benefits don't go to the people with disabilities, they go to the...
No, I'm not.
Can I just finish and
Rick, wait a minute. Will you do me a favour? Stop talking about people with disabilities.
Oh, right.
I don't accept that. Because if you want to equal it up, let's not talk about women. Let's talk about people without cops, right? Or instead of being people without white skin. Because that is what the term people with disabilities often mean. It is judgmental.
Right, okay, well, point taken, and I apologise. Just to finish, if I may, though, I think that those 3 models, those 3 new developments, all tend to personalise care and support, detach them from their social and structural contexts. And my guess would be that that's the direction that the new Tory white paper on social care will take when it comes out. Okay, thanks.
Thanks. Bob, Sandra, who wants to come back first?
Bob, you look like you're itching.
I want to deal with several things quite simply. First of all, the fact that people can actually say what characters they know on television or in films actually shows you how invisible disabled people are within society. The second thing is, do workers go to work? Yeah, they go to work. Why? Why are they doing that? Why are they sending their labour to capitalists? Oh, they shouldn't be doing that, should they? No, not if you want socialism. They should stop working now, because that plays into the hands of the capitalists, surely. And that's the problem I've got with idealistic view. Yeah, you're right, Rick. We have seen the development of a right-wing shift in society from the 1970s with neoliberalism that reinforced individualism and created a greater market economy, and all that is true. However, what is the alternative for disabled people? I don't particularly like direct payment, but I would defend them in the same way if I would defend a worker going to work, because that is a necessity to survive. What's the alternative? Well, either to starve if you're a worker in a family, or if you're a disabled person, to spend your life sitting in a fucking nappy, waiting for the local council to send a care worker to feed you and wipe your ass. That is what we're talking about. So direct payment and independent living is about self-determination, but that seems to be only okay if you're nation state, but not a disabled person. So yes, there is a problem, but we live in a capitalist society, not a socialist one. And if we want betterment, then we've got to recognise there are contradictions within capitalism, and there is contradiction we as socialists have got to mediate, and one of them is the issue of who control our lives as disabled people, and independent living and direct payment at the moment is the only viable alternative to institutionalisation. I don't want to go back to me as a worker in the council determine what disabled people services should be like, because that's how it was. Social care is about warehousing disabled people. And yeah, I'm anti-privatisation, I'm anti-market, but I don't want to go back to the old social democratic welfareism, because in reality it's the same shit but in a different bottle. And that's what the left have constantly failed to get their head around, is that the oppression is about being excluded, marginalised, and controlled. And I'll end on this point. Recently, Jeremy Corbyn launched his Peace and Justice project. We watched it, and if I had been a Martian coming down to Earth that day, watched that, I would not know that there were any disabled people on Earth. And how can you talk about justice when you exclude 10% of the population? That is what disability policy is about, changing social relations, not looking after, not patting her on the head, not talking for her, but actually recognising the imbalance of power which is determined by capitalist social relations. Sorry.
That's okay. I wanted to say something about power. And it was really in relation to Roland's point, because, yes, disabled people often, and especially learning disabled people, people with communication, that they communicate in a different way, often don't get heard. And I think austerity has made things a hell of a lot worse, the austerity because the local authorities often were funding small projects like the advocacy group that I work for, and giving them a small amount of money to provide support for people to go and challenge when they got benefit issues, or to help them to be able to speak up at meetings to get the support that they needed or wanted, and to, you know, really sort of try and also take part in local democracy. So the project I worked for was a self-advocacy project, and they sit on boards to do with the local city council so that they could actually speak up and make sure that their community's voice got heard and the resources they needed, you know, got provided. But once we started to have austerity, that all disappeared. And often the commissioning process in the city council became about consortiums, and a lot of the time what used to happen was that you had to put down the organisation to be part of the consortium. They had to have capital, and for a lot of these small user-led DPOs, they didn't have that. They didn't have that money, so often they would, you know, lose their position within that community group, and the community group would either start doing something different that could give them revenue, so therefore maybe it wasn't about rights, maybe it was more about service delivery, instead of supporting people to get what they needed and to make sure that they knew their rights and what they were entitled to. So yeah, I think, you know, definitely in terms of disabled people having a voice, it has become less and less. And as Bob said, the Peace and Justice meeting, Jeremy Corbyn's Peace and Justice meeting was launched, we were completely invisible. Yet we know Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell know the issues that disabled people face because they spent a lot of time with DPAC, and DPAC did a lot of work with them. But obviously that has just completely been forgotten. And the only reference we had at the Peace and Justice meeting was we were talked about in the sense of vulnerable. So the left really need to start to understand how disempowered disabled people have been. We're all sections of society, and we really need your help to start to be able to speak about these things and change that narrative, because we're just completely disappearing. You know, as Bob said, if you're an alien, you just wouldn't know disabled people actually existed. So we really do need people to really start understanding we have our backs to the wall, and in effect they want us to disappear, apart from us being classed as vulnerable. And we know that what happened with regards to the pandemic, a lot of large majority of the people, the deaths are from disabled and elderly people. So we really do need that backing to be able to start to take things forward.
Thank you, Sandra. Okay, I'm just going to take the last round of comments. So the first person I've got is John. Are you able to unmute yourself, John?
Yeah, I wanted to reinforce, I suppose, the invisibility that disabled people, that I feel as a disabled person, from the left, from particularly, say, the anti-cuts that are going on and campaigns to support workers, stopping workers' rights, terms and conditions being reduced. I'm out there supporting them, but they're not here when I'm getting cuts in the services. Those same workers are also implementing the cuts. So the solidarity between the two groups is not, it's in my interest to support them. It's in their interest to support us, but it's not coming. And we're invisible, we're ignored, we're on the margin on the side. margins, and we keep, yeah, I don't know how to make that point as strong, you know, that we're invisible, we're being ignored, we're being rode over again and again and again, and we're still campaigning with the left, but we're excluded. With the right, I know where I am with the right, I know what they're doing, I know exactly where the fight is, but I didn't expect the left to be the same. You know, it's even harder to get our voice heard. The campaign slogan that we talked, the speakers finished with, nothing about us without us, is still totally relevant now. So yeah, that's really what I wanted to. How do you build that solidarity, that understanding, that trust that the left aren't going to just exclude us again when we support the other campaigns that are kind of a side issue? We're coming out, risking our services, coming out campaigning, and then workers are coming in, social services workers that are part of unions are coming in, or DWP staff are cutting, and we're fighting that. There doesn't feel a solidarity between what we talked about. PIP assessments are done by the workers. We're fighting that, but I don't see the other side. And it's a difficult one for them, I know, but it's a difficult one for us when we're coming out, when we are experiencing reduces in services. We're just now in a position defending services that are still disabling, but they're better than nothing. So we're actually not even looking at enabling real services that enable, empower, give us real independence. We're just so frightened of losing what we've got. And we haven't even got onto that bit of transforming real services that actually empower us. That's what I would say.
Thanks, John. Susan?
I'll just say one more thing. I think what we need is we need the left to start to be allies, and that is not about taking control.
Yeah.
It is not about paternalism and doing for us. It's about working with us and supporting us. That is what an ally is, and we do desperately need the left to understand that and to understand the positions we're in and campaign with us on the way forward.
Thanks, Sandra. Susan?
I just wanted to raise something going back to the discussion on austerity, because if we looked at the two groups of people who were whose lives were most impacted by austerity, it was women and people with impairments. In fact, I would say that the contradictions that exist within capitalism have created the exact similarities of the problem. So on the one hand, they demand that women work and that they participate. On the other hand, they won't provide those things that will enable it and make it easier for us to participate in the side. Childcare, full nursery schools, things along those, help and support in the additional social reproduction that we do constantly. And it's a very similar issue, because as a disabled one, you sit and realize that, okay, Imber, you got to close your volume. Okay. As a disabled woman, you suddenly realize that you're getting caught on two things, because as a woman, your rights in many senses wind up, oh, don't worry, it's all you'll make it to the glass ceiling, all this nonsense. Well, on a basic level, we don't have the support to actually do the jobs that we have to do to survive, plus the additional social reproduction. What we have here is a societal problem, where the role of people who are working class people is to work. But what happens if you don't fit into that mold? And how are then people treated? And the inconsistencies. And one of the, to recognize that the problem is not your impairment. It's not your biological sex, but it's the way in which society treats you. It leads to this idea of penalizing you for not fulfilling the roles that you're supposed to play within the society, and at the same time, they infantilize you. and tell you what to do. And I think one of the biggest problems is that a lot of, I think it's quite sad in many senses that a lot of the left might understand this intellectually, but when push comes to shove, instead of hearing what people need, instead of listening to what people want and what they're fighting for, they're saying, okay, we're in solidarity, this is what we should do. And say, no, we hear you, and you tell us how we can stand together as allies. And I think that's essential. And that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. I wanted to say a couple of things myself. I wanted to go back to Dave's point earlier about charity. And certainly one of the things that I think I've experienced as a disabled woman is the way that many of the charities that exist are very much based on the model of, I mean, I think this is true of most charities, whether or not they're organised around sections of disabled people. But it's very much the do-gooding model of these poor people. And part of the strength of the slogan of nothing about us without us comes from the anger of having organisations that are run by non-disabled people claiming that space as we're wonderful, you know, we're dedicating so much of our energy to being nice to these poor people, as Bob says, patting people on the head in an incredibly patronising way. So I think that's one thing that has, I mean, it has shifted over recent decades in the sense that disabled people's organisations have more space than they had when I was growing up. But I think there's still that patronising attitude very much. And then just to emphasise what Bob said about direct payments, I remember having this argument at I'll remain nameless, but some people know him, at a Unison conference some years ago when direct payments were first coming in. And very much the view that Bob put forward was being put forward by disabled people in Unison, that while we could see that the model wasn't perfect, it did give us a certain amount of autonomy. That isn't to justify everything every disabled person has done in regard to the people that they employ. And I know within this room, a number of us have not been happy about some of those attitudes, but that's like, I don't justify everything that every woman on the planet has done. That's not the point. But I think in a situation where the alternative is institutional care, which as a number of people have talked about, gives us no say over our own lives, that's a different situation. So I just wanted to reiterate that. Now, listen, Mark's put his hand up. Is it okay to take him and then bring the panel back? And then we'll end. So, Mark.
Yes, having listened to this talk with interest and the growing realization that I've got an invisible impairment in that I'm actually functionally blind in my left eye. And it's a strange thing, because actually it is, although I can do lots of normal things, I can drive a car, I can go walk about, I can do all sorts of things, yet there are so many invisible or tiny little barriers that make life difficult, even for somebody who is, formally speaking, sighted. The little barriers like small low steps, which I'm very prone to tripping and falling because with low steps that I cannot see. Things like if I sing in a couple of choirs, and it's really difficult to read the music because the print is small and because the lighting is so poor. It's all sorts of little struggles. And unfortunately, I think in a ways, I'm probably the beginning of the journey, because I know that I'm eventually going to get cataracts in my other eye, which would eventually probably make me much more impaired. I'm still learning the phraseology and trying to get them right, which is I'm not perfect in that respect. But if at some point I probably lose the ability to drive, and I would find it more and more difficult to actually get out and about, particularly because I've lost the sight in one eye. They are reluctant to operate on cataracts in the other eye because of the danger, slight there might be, of damaging the eye. During that process. Anyway, I just have that little sort of situation to talk about, really.
Thanks, Mark. Bob, Sandra, who wants to come back first? You need to unmute, Bob.
I'll let Sandra go first.
As I said, I think it is about us all working together, and it is about allies. It's about, the left being allies for disabled people. And I think tonight's been really good because, we've had a presentation, we've had an opportunity to talk about impairment, disability, and obviously the different models. And I think for some people, that's a new perspective. Obviously, understanding what impairment is and the barriers that disabled people face within society. And I think a lot of times people don't identify as disabled people because they see it as a very negative thing to do. And yeah, let's face it, society does make it very negative. So I think it's really good that we come together, we discuss, and maybe we need to have more topic discussions to try and unite us and work together in a way which takes things forward rather than keeps things in a very static position.
Thank you, Sandra. Bob?
Okay, so tonight we have just skimmed the surface. There's so many other issues involved, but I just want to leave you with this sobering thought about the individual tragedy, dominant view of society, and the role of normality. So normality is a crucial part of controlling and regulating people. I wonder how many people here are aware that if we were to get into the time machine and go back to 1950, that any gay man or lesbian in this meeting would be classed as a disabled person, that they would be considered to have a psychological impairment that disables them. So you can see how normative value works. So we need to go forward. And as Sandra said, we need allies, but also raising the point that Rick made. We've got to actually educate disabled people as well. Because over the last 20 years, we've become depoliticized. And one way we want to try to address this, don't know how far we'll get, but we want to set up a new alliance of disabled socialists so we can start to look at the political issue and look at how we can best self-organize. Because really, the disabled people movement doesn't exist anymore. And where pockets does exist, they tend to be very bourgeois in their outlook, very self-interest. So we've got a big fight on our hands. So that is one project we want to get underway.
Thanks very much, Bob, and thanks everybody for attending this evening. I hope everybody else has found it as fascinating as I have. It's been good to have so much participation from the audience, stimulated by the excellent presentation. Other comrades have been putting up the link to anti-capitalist resistance. It would be great if people who weren't members considered joining, but even if you're not at that stage, at least check the website out and see what we have to say. I'd also strongly recommend, if people haven't got a copy of one of Bob's books, More Than a Left Foot, published in another lifetime before lockdown, get hold of it. It's got a lot to say about how disabled politics have changed, the highs and the lows, and it's a great read. So thank you all very much. And the other, yes, Susan's just put out, so ACR is organising an event this weekend. We've got another public meeting next Thursday. There's lots going on, so do check it out.